In this video, we're going to be talking about dates. Now, in JavaScript programming, you might often be working with dates and time. Thankfully, JavaScript provides a date object for this specific purpose. So let's see how that works. First of all, how do you work with dates in JavaScript? Well, sure, you can write a date as a string and it'll store it like a string, but you don't have to do that because in JavaScript we have the dedicated date object which allows you to work with dates and times in a much more flexible and more powerful way. Now, you have to remember that in JavaScript, dates are actually stored as milliseconds since the Unix epoch time. And the Unix epoch is actually a specific time in history, which is January 1, 1970 at midnight UTC. So this is the time that is called the Unix epoch. And dates in JavaScript are stored as milliseconds since this specific time in history. Now, in order to create a new date object, you declare a variable in order to store the object, in this case variable d equals new date. Now you have to type in d as capitalized because otherwise it won't work. So new date creates a new date object. In this case, variable d, or the new date object, will hold the current date and time as its value, which means it'll hold the specific date and time when this code is executed. In this case, it might look something like this. So if this code is executed at Tuesday, April 10, 2018 at 21:24:53 UTC time, then this is the value variable d will have with the new date object. Now do note that this date is static. So once this code is executed, this is the specific time value that this variable and the object will have. In real world, the time and the seconds will move on, but the variable d will always contain this specific time. So it's a static value. It's not dynamically updated. Now, if you type in d in order to access the value of the variable, you'll get something like the example below. Tuesday, April 10, 2018, then the time and time zone. Now this might come off as a string, but internally, JavaScript, the date object, actually stores this date as milliseconds since the Unix epoch time. But when you actually access the variable, the value is given off as date and time in strings. Also note that if you're using JavaScript in a website or a web application, then when you call new date, the specific date and time created will depend on the specific user's browser and system. So different users will get different dates as their value. So just by calling in new date, you can create a date object with current date and time. But that's not exactly useful. Sometimes you might not want the current date and time. Sometimes you might want to create a date object at a specific date and time. JavaScript allows you to do that as well. In this case, there are a few ways to do that. The first way is to create a new date object, and then instead of blank pair of parentheses, inside you can actually put in a parameter. You can put in a number, and this is the number which will be the number of milliseconds since the Unix epoch. So in this case, if you put in new date 0, then the date will be exactly the Unix epoch time, which is January 1, 1970 UTC midnight. But in this case, we have inputted new date 86.4 million. 86.4 million milliseconds, if you calculate, is exactly 1 day or 24 hours, which means this date object will be 1 day after the Unix epoch time, or something like this. So Unix epoch is January 1, 1970, and new date 86.4 million, which means 1 day after the Unix epoch, is Friday, January 2, 1917, midnight UTC time. So by specifying the number of milliseconds since the Unix epoch time, you can create a new date object with a specific date and time. Now you can also input the date and time separately in different parameters. In this case, we're using new date, and instead of inputting the number of milliseconds since the Unix epoch, we are inputting the date and time specifically in different parameters. The first parameter will be the year. In this case, it's 2016. The second parameter will be the month. In this case, it's 2. But in JavaScript, actually months start from 0 to 11 and not from 1 to 12. So 2 doesn't actually mean February, but 2 actually means March. We'll see how this works in just a moment. Then the third parameter is the date. In this case, it's 21. The fourth parameter is the number of hours. In this case, it's 15 or about 3 p.m. Then we have minutes, so it's 3:30 p.m. And then we have minutes, so it's 30 minutes, and the value after that is seconds, so it's 12 seconds, and finally the last value is the number of milliseconds. In this case, it's 200. If you create a date object like this, then the value will be somewhat like this. So as you can see, we have a new date object with the value Monday, March 21, 2016, 15:30:12 UTC time. So in this case, we have created a date object which is March 21, 2016, 15:30:12. You don't see the millisecond here, but JavaScript has calculated the millisecond internally as well. Now, if you create a new date object like this, you can input up to 7 different parameters, starting with the year, then month, then date, then hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. However, you don't have to specify each one of them. At minimum, you have to specify only 2 of them, which is the year and the month, and it'll create a date object like that. So in this case, if you only specify the year and month, as in this case we are specifying 1975 and 7, then we're telling JavaScript to create a date with the year 1975 and month is 7, which is August. And because we're not specifying all the other values, JavaScript just defaults to 1 or 0. In this case, because we didn't specify a date, we have 1 as the date, and time is 000 GMT 0. Now when it comes to the year, you don't have to input the full year. You can input 1 or 2 digits, and in that case, it will be treated as a 19 and then those 2 digits. In this case, we have new date 83/2/14, which is actually equivalent to March 14, 1983. So just by inputting 83, JavaScript treats 83 as 1983. So if you input just 1 or 2 digits instead of the 4-digit year, JavaScript will treat them as 20th century dates. Now when defining months for the date object in JavaScript, you have to remember that in JavaScript, the months start from 0 all the way up to 11 and not from 1 to 12 like we usually use. So in this case, January is actually 0, February is 1, and so on. So it's helpful to take a look at a table with all these index numbers. So this is how JavaScript actually treats months. 0 is January, 1 is February, 2 is March, 3 is April, and so on. So the months actually start from 0 and go all the way up to 11. This is very important to remember because oftentimes we calculate months starting from 1 in real life, which means when creating a date in JavaScript, we might actually create the wrong date. So for example, if we want the month of a date object to be in April, we might mistakenly type 4 because 4 is April when you count from 1. But in JavaScript, because month counts start from 0, April is actually 3. So be careful with that. Now days in JavaScript, although we don't define them when creating a new date object, also start from 0, starting with Sunday. And they also work towards 0 to 6. So 0 is Sunday, 1 is Monday, 2 is Tuesday, and so on. Starting with 0 and all the way up to 6. This is how days are represented in JavaScript. Now, when creating a specific date and time, you already know that we can specify the number of milliseconds since Unix APIC. We can also specify the date and time as separate specific parameters. But in JavaScript, we can also use a string and parse it as a date object, kind of like this. So in this case, we have var d equals new date. Instead of specifying the number of milliseconds since the Unix APIC, or specifying the date and time separately as different parameters, we can type in a date string, basically a string that contains a date or a time. So in this case, we have 25 March 2012, and most of the time, JavaScript will actually create the right date for you. In this case, new date results in Sunday, March 25, 2020, 000 UTC time. So it can parse a lot of different strings and format, and most of the time it'll return the correct result. So if we have a different format such as 1999, then a -02 -15, which means 15th February 1999, JavaScript also parses this correctly and will give you Monday, February 15, 1999, 000 UTC time. You can also specify the time as well. So, new date, 5 August 2005, 1850-20 will create a date object with value Friday, August 5, 2005, 1850-20 UTC time. Now, having a date as a string and converting it into a date object like this may seem very convenient and helpful. Unfortunately, when you parse a string as a date, the result is inconsistent among browsers. Different browsers support different formats, and the results are not very reliable. That's why it's strongly recommended not to parse strings as dates. Instead, define the number of milliseconds since the Unix APIC, or specify each of the date and time parameters separately in the date object. But parsing them as strings is not a very good idea because the results can be inconsistent and unreliable. Same goes for the date.parse method. They work almost similarly to the new date method and can accept different formats, and most of the time it'll return the correct result. You can also specify time as well. In this case, we're using the ISO format, and most of the time, again, it'll return the correct result. But because these two methods are very similar, it's strongly discouraged to use the date.parse as well. Instead, use the new date object and specify the number of milliseconds or the date and time parameters separately, because using date.parse or parsing a string as a date can have certain unexpected outcomes. Now, sometimes you might have two different dates and you need to calculate the difference between them. So how many days or months or seconds or whatever is the difference between two date objects? You can calculate date differences very easily in JavaScript. So first, let's have a start date. In this case, it's new date 2017 5/17 10/30/00. And we have an end date, which is 2018 1/3/6/20. So we have a start date and we have an end date. These two are several months apart. So how do we calculate the difference between them? So how many days are the difference between the start and end days? Well, you can actually just minus the end date from the start date. And because JavaScript stores the date object internally as the number of milliseconds since the Unix APIC, minusing end from the start date will give you the number of milliseconds that's the difference between these two date objects. So when you have the number of milliseconds, you can format it as you like. For example, because we know there are 86.4 million milliseconds in a day, So if we divide the end minus start by 86.4 million milliseconds, then we get 230.826 days, or almost 231 days. So that's how we can minus and divide in order to find out that the differences between these two dates are almost 231 days, which is about 8 months.